Hey, everyone, this is going to be a fun topic to talk about. In general, kind of board governance is one of those areas that I have a lot of interest in and conviction for, in the way that either good board governance or identifying bad board governance, and there's a lot of both of those going on in the nonprofit world. And this is a topic that we'll touch on some of that today. And so I'm going to leave more time for questions, because this is intentionally, whenever we do this topic, there's lots of good discussion questions that come up. And so I'm going to leave at least half the time for lots of good questions to come in. So start thinking about the questions that you want to put in, and you may want to preemptively start sending those to Shannon now through that questions tab, and she'll start tabulating them. So here we go. First of all, interestingly, I believe that the most distinguishing factor of any nonprofit is its board. Now, what I really mean by that is, you might think that it's your mission, and obviously your mission is what everyone has passion for, and is probably the reason for it is the reason for your organization's existence. But if you look at what appear to be kind of two similar nonprofit organizations that may exist in similar settings of similar size, take a couple of homeless shelters, for instance, that may exist in the same city, maybe operating in different areas, about the same size, about the same budget, and that sort of thing. You might think on the surface that they appear to be very similar organizations. But what we find when we kind of scratch through the surface and really understand how they operate is that the manner in which they operate internally, the most distinguishing factor or contributing factor to its uniqueness is the way that its board interacts with them. For instance, when you look into almost any nonprofit organization, boards are constantly kind of moving or swinging like this pendulum you see on the screen right here, in terms of being, very engaged to not so engaged. And you can probably think of your own organization today and think about where that pendulum might be. Now, there is a sweet spot in the middle, that when boards are just the right amount of engaged, and they're doing everything that you'd want and hope, and yet they're not so engaged that their fingers aren't in the pie. Go back to those two homeless shelters that I described a moment ago. You can imagine that if one board was over on that far extreme of the micromanaging side for a moment, and the board, they have board standing committees that are personnel committees and program committees and HR committees and all those kinds of standing committees that maybe some of your boards have. In those organizations, we tend to find lots of confusion and turmoil, because you have staff who don't really understand who their boss is, right? If you're the HR director for your organization and you have a boss who is the executive director of the organization, but you also have an HR committee or a personnel committee who may also be giving you direction, you can imagine that there can be confusion. Whereas the other organization, the other homeless shelter that's very similar, may have a board that's completely on the other side, of disengaged and uninvolved. Maybe they meet a couple times a year and attendance isn't even that good when the board meets. They don't really have functioning standing committees, and they don't have any of the benefits necessarily of having an impassioned group of volunteers to lead and guide it down a successful path. So the idea is that this pendulum is always swinging in some direction. Now, usually it doesn't swing to the extremes. I recognize that. But it's normally moving a bit back and forth, and it crosses through that ideal kind of domain, or that ideal section of the range of the spectrum here every once in a while, and that's when you really have things clicking. An important observation. But interestingly, when I begin working with most organizations, and oftentimes I'm addressing the board of the organization, and somebody around the table will inevitably raise their hand and say, "Excuse me, Skylar, you should know we're not one of those fundraising boards," okay? You know the type, right? Those boards that are put together only for fundraising. And while I would sit back and say, I do recognize that most boards are not put together solely for the purpose of fundraising. But my response to that observation is, oh, yes, you are. Okay? You are a fundraising board, whether you know it or not. Whether you're a policy board, a board of directors, a trusteeship, an advisory board, you are still a fundraising board. Okay? Every board has that duty and has that task of being a fundraising board. I liken it like this, and this is an analogy that some of you may have heard me share along the way, but I liken the role or the relationship between a board and its mission to similar to that of a parent and a child. Okay, meaning if any of you are parents, and probably many or most of you are, okay, you know, if we sat and started brainstorming characteristics that are the role a parent has in a child's life, we would come up with things like you're a provider and you're a disciplinarian, you're a teacher, you're a mentor, you're and a million characteristics could come up, and we would probably agree on most of those characteristics. So you can imagine that if my son came home one day and said, "Hey, Dad, let's go in the backyard and have a catch," okay, with baseball, and I said, "You know, son, I'm sorry, I'm not really that kind of dad. I'm just a dad that provides and disciplines you." Okay, and my son would look at me like I'm crazy because I'm the only dad he has. Guess what? They are the only board you have. So for a board to systematically carve out those responsibilities, and if a board really took time to brainstorm, if it was trying to be everything that it could to be to your mission, they would probably say that they are things like they are accountable. They hold the organization accountable. They provide guidance, they provide advice and counsel, they provide mentorship, they provide disciplinary work. But they are also providers, and fundraising is one of those key aspects, because if your board, as an impassioned group of volunteers, isn't willing to be involved in fundraising, then how can you make a case for why someone less close to your organization can do the same, right? So they're the only board you have, and if they systematically carve that out, then inevitably they are handicapping your organization to be all that it can be or all that it could be. So that's the first seed that I want to plant with you around this. So let's talk about how a board can keep from drifting into management, and this is the broad discussion first of how this works. But my first observation is by having the right kind of standing committees. Okay, so what are the right kind of standing committees? They are probably, and if your board is functioning well, you probably have something called a finance committee. Okay, and there's almost always a finance committee. Sometimes it's a finance/audit committee, and they really take on one of the greatest responsibilities the board has, according to the IRS. And you have to have a board, at least a 4-person board, that holds the organization accountable financially, and you take on a great responsibility in doing so. They might have a governance committee, and that is a governance committee is intended to define and hold the board accountable for what the board is supposed to do in providing governance and oversight to the organization. They also generally identify and nominate new board members and set the terms and the bylaws and so forth of the organization. Then you might have another committee or two that are involved, but just as importantly here is you need to, in addition to having the right committees, you need to make sure you don't have the wrong committees. So let me talk about what some of the wrong committees are, and I know some of you may take issue with this, so please don't get defensive. I'm not attacking any organization on purpose. The wrong committees are committees that align with staff functions. So if you have a program committee, for instance, or a curriculum committee or an education committee because you're a school, then you probably have a committee that is paralleling staff functions. And if you do that, then what you're doing is you're creating an environment where the board feels like they can begin to intervene and interact directly with your program staff. And that's where the conflict comes in. Suddenly a board is not doing board work anymore. Now it's doing management work, which is the CEO or the president or the executive director's role. Now you've created two bosses, or the two-headed monster, so to speak. If you have a personnel committee or an HR committee, once again, assuming you have somebody, a staff member that's operating in the HR or personnel world, now you have that conflict again. The one exception to that rule, of course, is the development committee, okay? Because the development committee, while it's not intended to ever be a boss of the development department, and I'm going to say that a couple more times because it's a very clear role that the board committee should have, an important role that a board committee should not, that a development committee should not have, is the development committee should not be the boss of development, because the development, as a development director, director of advancement, or whatever your title may be, you have a boss, and you should only have one boss, and that is the president, executive director, or CEO of your organization. That is the one person in the organization to whom you should be accountable. The purpose of a development committee is not to be the boss, but it is to instead become a subset, if you will, of impassioned volunteers who serve on that board, a subset of the board, who agree to come alongside and help the development team by representing that impassioned volunteer at work in your mission. They should become additional arms and legs to help you implement things, not simply sit around a table and walk through an agenda and provide oversight and steering and guidance to you. And it's fine for them to give advice, but the most important thing that they are the impassioned volunteers. As development staff, we can sometimes be perceived as hired guns, right? Because we're paid to be professional fundraisers. However, when we have that impassioned volunteer in the form of a board member sitting beside us during a donor meeting, or during a time when you might be inviting a prospective donor to give, that changes the dimension entirely. And so having that subset beside you of the board, the people who agree to kind of lead by example and play that role, that becomes critical. Unfortunately, there are very few development committees that exist today that truly carry out that role. And they have a tendency to act more like the other boss of the development department. They have a tendency to come in and think, well, hey, it's our job as a development committee to come up with new events or launch new activities and events, and to tell the development director what we want them to do this year. And that should never be the role. That has to be redefined probably by your governance committee or by the board itself if you're going to change it, but it's an important piece for you to get squared away. What is not the development committee's role? Okay, staff management. Meaning, if anything looks like management instead of sort of governance, it's probably the development committee stepping into the staff's role in their activities. Development tactical planning. Now, while you do want the development committee to own the big goals for the year, and if you're trying to raise $1 million this year, for instance, and that would be one of the goals that the development committee would own and probably bring to the board and say, hey, board, let's own this goal as an entire organization. That's great. But when you get down into the strategies and tactics, those should always be the responsibility of your development team and your development staff, not ever be board functions. You don't want the board in the weeds on those kinds of things. Boards or development committees should never be the event planners, okay? And I see this happen way too many times, that whoever is chairing the development committee has carte blanche with what the gala is going to look like this year, what the auction is going to be, and inevitably try new and creative things. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but it creates this very inconsistent kind of development operation. And the reality is there ought to be, most of that planning ought to be done by development staff. Hiring decisions. Hiring decisions should, again, fall to your CEO, president, executive director, whatever that person's title is, meaning who's our development director, who are the development staff members. Development committee members should not be involved in those kinds of things, because that, again, puts them in that kind of direct conflict, potentially at least, with your CEO. And firing decisions in the same. Okay, so just some things to think about. And look, so many organizations that have development committees today, they have the development committees because somewhere along the way, somebody said, hey, you should have a development committee. They didn't say how the development committee should necessarily function. And so a development committee gets together and forms and don't know instinctively necessarily what they're supposed to do as a development committee member. And so they begin to look for things to do. And this is what historically has gotten development committees in trouble, because they start thinking, well, we can help by designing a new event. We can help by helping them manage. We can give them oversight and direction. We can help interview new candidates for a new staff member or something like that. And those are things that, again, puts them in conflict with the organization. So there needs to be very clean lines of communication and very clean separation between the board and the staff of any organization. So what you're looking at here in this diagram is the board and the staff clearly separated by whomever your executive is. Okay, again, it's a CEO. That one person, in other words, sits between those two groups of people. The CEO is the only employee of the board. Okay? Everyone else works for the CEO. The board has one employee, and it is the CEO. The staff only has one boss, and it is the CEO. Everybody reports up kind of essentially to, even though there may be multiple layers of management in your organization, ultimately everyone comes through that executive. When you create a development committee, you're in essence taking a slice out of each of those bodies, the development staff and a group of board members, a small group of board members who agree to work beside the development staff, and you create a collaborative relationship. You do this because what we ultimately need the board to do is lead by example to the broader community, to your broader support base. We need them to be visible in terms of, number one, giving their personal resources, but also leading by example in terms of opening their networks and representing that impassioned volunteer as you continue to interact and communicate with your support base. The real secret to doing this successfully is the manner in which you build a development committee. So some of you are sitting back saying, okay, I've got a development committee today, and it's obviously making some mistakes. We may not be functioning the way we want to be functioning. How do we get there? So, or maybe you're sitting back thinking we need to start a development committee. In either case, hopefully these ideas and suggestions will help. Let me share with you some of the common mistakes that are made as some organizations maybe begin to think about putting together a development committee. Okay, step one, you gotta take some time to identify the right candidates and do it in the right way. So we'll talk in a moment about what the common mistakes look like when this happens, but the key here is that this committee should be formed probably differently than most other board standing committees, in the sense that you ought to take time to figure out who it is that you need on this committee to be very effective and successful in your work, and then seek them out. Okay, so identify the right candidates, put together a sound enlistment plan, a step-by-step process that is going to lead to them saying, yes, I'd like to serve on that committee, and then ultimately provide them with some training and orientation for functioning in that role. So let's take that process just a little farther here. We talk about some of those common questions. Okay, here's a common mistake that's made. Donna has a lot of time on her hands. She'd be great for this. Okay, maybe. She might be good. On the other hand, she may not be. Just the fact that she has time doesn't necessarily mean that she would be good. Okay, so you got to make sure we're looking at the right characteristics for an effective and successful development committee. Yeah, this is the one that kills me. Hey, if you'd like to be on the development committee, let me see your hand. Okay, inevitably, maybe one or two of the right people raise their hand, but sometimes the wrong people raise their hand. This should not be a committee that is filled that way, because you're probably going to end up with some people who have no idea what they're really raising their hand to do. Okay, and this one of my favorites. The job is easy. You don't even have to make all the meetings. What do we have to do to get them to say yes? Hopefully not that. Okay, because it's not an easy job, and they are going to be leading by example and setting the example for the rest of the board to follow. So let's go back to the task of identifying candidates. Number one, you have to know they already have passion for your mission. Now, you'd like to think that it's a foregone conclusion that everyone who sits around your board table already has passion for your mission. That's not always the case. Okay, I've worked with so many organizations that when I actually have time to interact with their board, we find that there are some board members who are there in the hopes that they'll develop that conviction or passion for the mission. Hey, they're using in other words, they're using board seats as a cultivation tool in the hopes that they might turn into someone who eventually even becomes a current supporter. In a perfect world, that passion for the mission and support, financial support, would already be there before you would even invite them. That would be the price of admission to even be invited to the board. Hopefully, there's somebody that can bring a network, right? Introduce them to their friends, and that's intimidating to board members. And there's an artistic way of doing that in a different webinar we can dive deeper into, or if you want to talk about it in the Q&A time, you can ask about how we get board members to kind of open up their networks. But that's a critical piece, and obviously picking candidates for your development committee who have networks, or you believe network with the right kind of people, is important. Most importantly, their willingness to lead by example, to set the pace and set the bar at a high level that they will in turn around and charge the board. The other thing, and I will get into this in our kind of final couple of slides, is there may be sometimes when your development committee matures where you want to start looking for an area of expertise. Maybe somebody who is an estate planning attorney who can become an advisor as you seek plan gifts. Maybe someone who comes from an advertising or marketing background who may have some insight into helping you develop better collateral and proposal materials to utilize. So people that can not become a boss, but become a strategic advisor to certain aspects of your organization. Enlistment done well looks like this, okay? A face-to-face meeting, always. This is not something where somebody picks up the phone and says, hey, Fred, remember that favor you owe me? I need you to serve on this committee, right? Rather, it should be a very formal kind of invitation, because when you do it well, when you do enlistment well, you set precedent for how that job should be carried out. And I think you'll find that the committee will be much more engaged when they're met with in person by a couple of significant, important people. Okay? Maybe the development director, the executive director, and the board chair are all meeting with your candidate. Obviously presenting in some fashion or form what would effectively be a leadership proposal, not a giving proposal at this stage, but probably a proposal that asks them to serve, has a job description, maybe has an abridged version of your development plan, and things that they might need to know to better make that decision. And then training that follows. When somebody finally comes back and says, I'll do it, then letting them know that we do have an orientation process. We're going to take time to help you understand the role of the committee, what we do and what we don't do, okay? Expectations of each member. And obviously, the most important aspect of training is to ease everyone's anxiety around this thing called fundraising. Look, I've been doing this for 38 years now, I think it is. And I'm still a human being. And while my entire career and life has been kind of committed to fundraising, I'll admit, as a board member of some organizations, it's still anxiety filled. I mean, there's still an element of anxiety. And what I guess I'm saying to you is recognize that it is human nature, and every board member fears this to a degree, no matter what their occupation is, no matter how successful they are in life. They may not want to admit it, but most people do feel anxiety around fundraising. And the most important aspect of training is to reduce or eliminate that anxiety and help them get very comfortable with what you need to have them do. Training on relationship-based fundraising. And I know in our opening question today that most of you were sounding off on was, we said, when are you going to do a live event? You know anything about us, we're not big proponents of fundraising largely through events, that it is relationship-based fundraising. And ideally, that's where you want the engagement of your development committee to be. So what a development committee might look like is this, and this is kind of how it fits in the organization of your current structure. You have an existing board of directors or trustees or regents or whatever your organization may call it, your board. A development committee is a subset of that board, and it is intended to be positioned alongside of the development team, meaning as that collaborator. Or now, as the development committee grows, and maybe you begin to add elements of expertise, you might consider someone who is on the committee specifically to sit beside you, the development director, or your executive director, in meeting with some of their peers and some other donors, inviting them to participate in your annual giving. You may have a communications expert, that advertising or public relations pro that you can bring onto the committee, who will provide some greater advice and insight, maybe some new creative ideas to your communications department. You may consider adding somebody with expertise in events, not necessarily to change the event, but to throw some creative ideas to the staff who are planning the event. A planned giving expert, maybe somebody who is serves as an executive director of a foundation somewhere that you've received grant money before, and consider them as a development committee member who can help give insight into how foundations and corporations think and make decisions, and help your team navigate that process. What do development committee meetings look like? What should they look like in an ideal world? Number one, obviously they ought to be focused on relationship-based activities. Fundraising is not done, as probably most of you know, at least effectively, from inside your office with the door closed. Okay, and I know, the pandemic has caused all of us to have to rethink everything to a degree, but the sooner you are able to kind of return to some level of normalcy, and I know it's beginning to happen in certain parts of the country, it will continue to happen in the months ahead. The idea is to open that office door and get out and start being visible again to your donors and build those relationships that are all important. Brainstorm, the committee might brainstorm on ways that the committee can engage with the staff. And in a perfect world, that's also including donors. How can they engage with staff while they're engaging or interacting with donors? The idea then is the chair and the DOD, the development director of development, make assignments and then ask committee members to execute those assignments, maybe follow up to make sure that they're done. It functions like any committee that you might have doing other kinds of things. With the caveat, again, that the development committee, I'll say it one last time, development committee is not the boss of development. How do you start? The board chair, your executive director, your development director meet and discuss and agree on the qualities and characteristics that you would have on development committee members. Okay, start small. The worst mistake that I see made all the time is people think, oh, this is a great idea, let's get a 10-member committee. And it's so hard to get 10 members doing the right thing all at the same time. Start with a development committee chair and maybe one additional person. Engage them and then let the committee grow as the year goes on. But set precedent for how they will be engaged. It's much easier to start small. As you build it, you can continue to add members. You might even consider asking the board if you can enlist a couple of committee members who are not board members. Okay, and for organizations who are constantly looking for new board members, what a great way to find them. I mean, if you have somebody who's a part of your development committee who is performing well, a donor, and developing passion for your mission, then they might very quickly, the development committee can very quickly become an on-deck circle for future board members. Development committee should lead by example and challenge the board's involvement, okay? Meaning, the reason why you have a subset is because it's easier to get a subset engaged deeply and send them back and let them challenge their peers to do others. So the idea isn't that a development committee replaces the need for the entire board to be involved. And that's what you have to be careful of. Sometimes when a board creates a development committee, the rest of the board sits back and goes, oh, I don't have to worry about that anymore. We got a development committee that takes care of that, so we don't have to. That's not the case. The development committee leads the charge, but then it's the development committee's role to come back and challenge the rest of their peers to follow them in suit and get involved, both giving, opening their networks, and things like that. And then obviously serving as additional arms and legs, as resources to ultimately achieve the development goals of the year. I've said this probably way too many times, and I'm sure that there may not be any questions on this point, but again, the development committee doesn't preside over the staff. Let me stop there. I think I was good to my, pretty good in my commitment. We've still got a good 25 minutes left for questions, and let's make the best of the time that we have remaining here. Shannon, what do we have?
Awesome. Well, we have a lot of great questions to get through. Before we start, I do just want to remind everyone that I will be sending a recording and the slides and that board development committee worksheet out to you guys following today's session. So you will be receiving that via email. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the questions panel on the right-hand side. So Skylar, our first one comes from Vivian, and she says, can you please comment on the business administrator role on the development committee and who provides direction on gift processing, designation, and typical protocol?
Yeah, Vivian, I'm not sure the size of organization and the exact perspective from which you're coming. If you're a very small organization, gift processing and everything might be done by the same person that does your, books and is your finance director and is the only person that you have doing anything related to the accounting and bookkeeping. In a larger organization, those jobs are all broken out, and ultimately, at some point, in a sizable organization, gift processing becomes a development office function. Granted, that function has to be audited and squared away by the finance director or the finance department of your organization, but it is a development office function down the road, because the recording and acknowledging of gifts is all part of the relationship building process that organizations have. So again, a development committee is intended to be a committee of the board. It's not intended to be a staff-heavy committee, although you would probably expect the development director to be a part of it. Probably not have the business administrator on that committee. What you want the board members to do is to engage with donors, not necessarily spend a lot of time auditing processes and systems that you have.
Great, thank you. So a follow-up question is, should enrollment and marketing be separate committees? I think that was because you talked about just the right committees and the wrong committees to have on your board.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, obviously this is coming from a school, right, with an enrollment department. So communications, I think, makes sense to have on your development committees per se, because communications plays a significant role in the marketing and an image the organization has to its support base, to the broader community that supports your organization, your school in this case. An enrollment committee is an effective committee to have, but not necessarily as a subcommittee of the board. When you start to build an enrollment committee, you have to sit back and say, what do we really want or expect the enrollment committee to do? And it's not to create the systems or the processes by which you enroll families. It's probably to be impassioned parents, okay, who can help supplement the role that you might have in the form of an admissions director or an enrollment director, whatever you may call him or her in your particular school. So as you know, certain times of the year, there are many new prospective school families that want to tour a school and really see what it looks like. The purpose of having that enrollment committee is to replicate the arms and legs of the enrollment director, so that you have a well-informed, well-trained parent, current parent of the school, who could walk a new prospective parent or entire family through the school, give a great guided tour, and really speak from personal conviction of why they support this school and why they believe your school is better than any other in the community. So that I would not have an enrollment committee necessarily be a function of the board.
Great. Victoria says, what if the staff is doing all of the work? Today, the staff is putting together the agenda, they're deciding the purpose of the meeting, they're really kind of driving the vast majority of the work for the development committee.
Yeah, that's oftentimes the case. And it obviously started happening that way at some point because the development committee allowed it to happen that way. So you have a development committee that's, go back to the pendulum, it's probably toward the disengaged side. So you probably want to figure out a way to have greater engagement, and that begins with the development committee chair. I would invite just the development committee chair to come in and spend a couple hours with you, lay out for him or her what your development plan is, and talk a little bit about doing things in a different way. So it would be so great if you, as our chair, kind of presided over our meeting, guided it and led it. And at the board meeting, when development report comes up, you should preside over that particular part of the agenda. Although the development committee chair might call on you as the development director to add some detail, you want the chair to report and talk to his or her peers on the board as if they have some understanding of what is going on in the area of development.
Great. And Victoria, that worksheet that I'll be sending out tomorrow with the recording will help you put together a charter and a purpose of the committee that perhaps you guys could have your committee re-enlist in a way and sign up for the expectations that you'd like them to have. So Dolores actually has the opposite problem, and she's saying that they have a fundraising committee, but they only have one employee. So there's only the executive director on staff. How does she ensure that the committee doesn't get into the weeds too much?
Sure. Let me backtrack a little bit. Take you back to the pendulum slide that you may recall in the beginning of this. And if you came on a little late, I showed you a slide that had a pendulum swinging on one side to the extreme. It was micromanaging. On the other side, it was complete disengagement. And the idea is you want the board or your development committee to function somewhere in the middle. When an organization is young and new, okay, and you may have one staff person, okay, the board has to be involved more in management functions. Okay, and I would liken it to the for-profit world. If you start a business tomorrow and you're the sole person running the business, you're not only the CEO, you're also the bookkeeper, you're also the marketing manager, you're the primary salesperson, and you're the janitor. Okay, you're everything, right? So, and then as you grow, you begin to kind of carve out responsibilities and delegate them to a team of people. You have to let go of those things. So if you're a young organization, of course the board is involved. What has to happen though, as the organization grows and as you do kind of bring on a development director, the board has to let go of at least some of the planning and responsibilities. They don't wash their hands of it entirely, but they take on a new level of, I should say, a lesser level of management and a greater level of guidance and governance. So, and that's the same as an organization grows. The organizations that get themselves into trouble are organizations that add staff positions, but never let the board disengage from those areas.
Great. Christopher says that his organization's small and doesn't have staff to do their upcoming gala. And so can he involve the fundraising committee to take more ownership of the events and provided that there's staff oversight?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to do whatever you have to do to get the job done, but don't give up oversight. Okay, meaning if you're going to engage a committee to do that, the committee should be accountable to you as the development director, not the other way around. Make sure it's not the committee suddenly telling you what you have to do and sending you out on errands and asking you to come back and report to them. It should be the other way around if you're going to engage a committee to ultimately do staff functions.
Great. Cindy asked this a little bit. I know that you touched on this towards the end of the webinar. She had submitted this question earlier, but I think it's worth reiterating. And she says, do committee members always have to be board members?
No, and I talked to you about some of the advantages of that. One is, there may be reasons why you want somebody on the development committee, but you don't really want them to be on the board. And it may be because they are in a particular area of expertise. Maybe they don't necessarily meet all the criteria that you would normally have to invite them aboard, but they could be great arms and legs and an impassioned volunteer to help you. Or sometimes, as you know, board members spend a lot of time brainstorming and saying, wouldn't it be great to have the president of XYZ bank on our board or something like that? If you're going to do that, think about engaging that president of the bank as a development committee member for a while. See if he becomes a donor, see if he develops that interest in your mission, and becomes somebody that it becomes a no-brainer that you want to invite that particular bank president to your board.
Great. Shannon, not me, but another Shannon is asking, what level of strategic planning detail is appropriate to share with the development committee? She goes on to say that they want to break it down to strategy and percent of projected income.
Strategy and percent of projected income, meaning by how much you're growing over what your baseline was. Okay, so I think that first of all, the fact that you're concerned about this is a good thing, right? I think ultimately you want to be transparent to your development committee, but the only thing, when I'm counseling an organization through strategic development planning, we want the development committee and the board to own the development mission, number one. Some of you may be wondering what that is. Okay, that's a whole other webinar. And number two, to own the big goals. Okay, just like, think about it for a moment. If your nonprofit organization is functioning with a normal strategic plan that's more programmatic or mission centric, they probably own your mission statement and your mission and vision statements, and they probably own the big goals in the strategic plan, but they don't own the strategies and the tactics. Those are functions that should be owned by the staff to carry out, but they're always accountable to the board in achieving the big goals that they've adopted. The same model works exactly for the development side. And there is something called a strategic development plan that can be produced. It's essentially the business plan for the development side. And we would ask the board to own the development mission and vision. And we would ask the board to own the big goals, but not the strategies and tactics that it takes to achieve those goals. That's where we kind of want to keep the board out. Doesn't mean they can't know what they are, but they just don't have necessarily input into how, because those are management functions.
Great. As a follow-up, she asked that they're looking to get committee members teed up for a future campaign by assigning them regular thank you calls. Is that a good strategy?
That can be a great strategy. I mean, it's obviously part of a broader stewardship strategy, and it's a peer-to-peer kind of thing. So it's an easy point of contact to make. It's a great kind of entry level for board members to begin to develop access to their peers who are also donors, and for them to say, hey, on behalf of XYZ organization and our entire board on which I serve, I just want to say thank you so much for the fabulous donor that you've been, and this is what you're helping make happen. The next time that board member wants to contact that donor, the donor is probably more apt to pick up the phone because now there's a new access point. So that can be a very important precursor, as you say, or prelude to a capital campaign.
Jamie's along that same lines. She asked, the ED is asking, what is the difference between the development committee and the campaign committee?
Yeah, the development committee is concerned with operational funding, okay? The recurring financial needs that your organization have year over year. So you probably have a budget of some size, and at least depending upon the kind of organization you are, you're probably responsible for raising funding to help pay for part of that budget every year. That is recurring operational needs. That is the function of the development office and the development committee. Once in a while, then, an organization has this extraordinary need that comes along, and it requires a huge spike in capital, right? And it's because we need to build a new building, because we need to start a new program, because we have to reduce debt, whatever it may be, and you have a campaign. The campaign committee is a different group of people because they have a very different function. And what they have to do is they have to raise X number of millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars, whatever it may be, without really disturbing your annual development, your annual operational funding. Okay? And so it has to be done very delicately, and you've got to be careful that a campaign is not allowed to cannibalize what's going on over here. That's why you want to make sure your development committee stays focused on that particular need. A campaign committee is a temporary committee, and it's usually an ad hoc committee of the board that helps to just address that additional over and above spike in funding that you need to build your new building.
Great. Christina's asking, what other tasks can you give your development committee members besides the stewardship portion, the emails and the calls out to donors?
The most of, if I were helping you, Christina, to build a development committee from scratch, or to get your development committee functioning, I would say pick if it's an existing committee, pick the member that you have the best relationship with today. And I would call him or her up and say, listen, I've got a meeting to sit with a donor next Thursday over coffee. Would you come and join me for that meeting? I'm not gonna, I don't need you to make the ask. I'm going to do that. But all I want you to do is I want you to introduce yourself as a board member and a development committee member. I want you to say, on behalf of our organization, thank you. And let me tell you why this organization is important to me as a board member. And I'll do the rest. But would you just come with me for that particular visit? That is the most effective role that you can ever have a board member, okay, or AKA development committee member, play in your organization, is suddenly they bring the impassioned volunteer element there. That while you're doing most of the heavy lifting as the development director, and you're probably going to, take on the task of saying, and by the way, would you continue to support us this year with a gift the size that you gave last year? Okay. The fact that that impassioned volunteer is there sitting next to you, you have that peer-to-peer element now in the room. And that is a critical aspect of what you're trying to accomplish. Okay.
Great. Ken is asking, do you have any guidance on moving from an event-based strategy to a relationship-based strategy? We get this question almost every single webinar, Skylar.
Yeah, and there's about 3 other webinars that deal with different aspects of that along the way. The quick answer is you're probably soaked with responsibilities and busyness around conducting all of the events. So the short answer is, if you're going to do what you desire to do, which is to launch a relationship-based strategy, you probably have to stop doing some of the things that you're doing. If you're event heavy, you probably have to nix 1 or 2 events and start thinking about, and then preserve that time and start having coffee or lunch or first one-to-one conversations with your donor base to start forging those relationships. And you need to think of yourself, again, it's not about, I get this question all the time of organizations that are moving into this relationship-based strategy. And the cynic would sit back and say, doesn't it sort of feels like I'm pretending to be someone's friend to get them to give a lot of money, right? If that's the way you're seeing it, you've got the wrong perspective on this. The relationship we talk about building is not between you and the donor, okay? It is between the donor and your mission. And you are only the ambassador of that relationship. So it's not about taking them out to play golf or taking them to an expensive dinner or anything like that. It's not about giving them perks or stuff. It is about helping them experience your mission, the very worthy mission that you represent, and letting that mission enrich their life. You're kind of their tour guide or the concierge. That's the way you need to think of yourself as you move into this role. Yeah, and you want affection to grow, but you want affection to grow between the donor and your mission, and not just give because you're such a nice guy or girl doing this work, right?
Great. I love this question that Paul submitted. So he said, Skylar, you mentioned that the board or committee members are not tasked with hiring and firing issues. What role, if any, should a development committee play in succession planning for key development positions?
I think that the answer to that is they should probably ensure that there is a succession plan, and maybe stamp their approval on the succession plan and represent that succession plan by owning it and taking it to the broader board. That means, hey, what do we do if our chief development officer resigns? Well, what should we do? Ultimately, it is the executive director or the CEO's responsibility to replace that role. So it has to be done in conjunction with and in support of the CEO. I think it's fine for a development committee to probably go down that path a bit and do some appropriate strategic thinking about how it happens. But understand, it's not the development committee responsibility alone to come up with that succession plan. It does have to ultimately be owned by the CEO. It can't be just a board function relating to development.
Great. Jenny's asking about the meeting agenda. How many topics should be covered at one time? How long are the meetings? How often?
Okay. Depends on a lot. There's a lot of variables here. So if you have a board that meets 4 times a year, okay, I would say then your development committee should probably meet once in between every board meeting, at least, maybe twice, depending upon the circumstances and the duration that you have between. And the idea is, the reason why you have a development committee is that they are doing the work of the board in that committee meeting, so that the board doesn't have to meet. I'm probably wading in deeper on this particular question than I want to, but it begs the bigger question of how often should boards meet, right? And if you have a board that meets every month, then you don't need to have standing committees, because there's no point to a standing committee doing anything if your board meets every month. The purpose of having committees is so your board doesn't have to meet very often. And so we'll do another webinar soon on the broader topic of best practices in nonprofit board governance. And I promise we'll touch on this and get in greater detail on it. But again, just a quick model: board meets 4 or 5 times a year, and your development committee meets 5 or 6 times a year. Okay, and in between board meetings, not hours before.
Great. And I think we have time for one more, but I know we had a ton of questions that we didn't get to, so I will follow up with each of you individually to answer those. But let's cover this one by Elizabeth. She said she laughed out loud when you said a challenge can be to form a development committee by asking people to raise their hand, because unfortunately that's what they did. So now they probably don't have the right people on their committee. So what should she do to maybe get some turnover, and should that align with the fiscal year? And can you talk a little bit about term limits?
Yeah. So in a perfect world, you will have term limits. It's really hard to fire a development committee, right? You can't say, we're done, we're fired. So you have to figure out a way to utilize them as best you can. Obviously, there's probably already preset meetings, or they're probably already planning to meet. The only way you're going to make significant change on this one, Elizabeth, is to, as your fiscal year turns and as the development committee is beginning, make sure you pull aside the board chair, your CEO, and have a meeting about this and say, look, I want to try building our development committee differently this year. Let's not worry about having so many members. Let's focus on getting 2 members that will actually engage with us and try some things, do some things that we really need them to do. And let's take time to identify who they should be. Let's enlist them the right way and see if we can really make a difference in how our development committee engages with our development operation.
Perfect. And again, Elizabeth, in that worksheet that I'm going to send out to all of you guys, you can use that to put together a new charter and purpose, and perhaps a new form to enlist those development committee members. So that could be a launching platform to revitalize the committee and perhaps get some new people on board. So I just want to thank you, Skylar, for joining us today, and all of the great information that you've given everyone. And thank you all for joining and taking time out of your day. Our next webinar is going to be April 22nd, and I'm really excited about this. We're going to have an executive conversation with Lynn McLean, and she is the CEO of the Children's Advocacy Center in Collin County. They just finished an $11 million capital campaign, and she's going to be talking to us about her role in the broader campaign and what she needed to be prepared for from a CEO perspective. So it's going to be a great discussion. I hope that you guys join us for that, April 22nd. And until then, take care. Thank you so much for joining today. Bye-bye.